A 7-year-old girl finds disturbing photos hidden in her stepfather's basement and takes them to school in her backpack. When she shows the pictures to the school counselor, the evidence of what was happening in their home makes him call 911.
Immediately. The morning sunlight filtered through the cream-colored curtains of the Morrison Crawford household, casting golden rectangles across the hardwood floors of their modest 2-story home on Maple Street. 7-year-old Lucy Morrison sat at the kitchen table, her small fingers wrapped around a glass of orange juice, watching the steam rise from her mother's coffee cup. The familiar sounds of their morning routine filled the air. The gentle hum of the refrigerator, the soft patter of Rebecca's nursing shoes against the linoleum floor, and the methodical chopping of David as he prepared scrambled eggs at the stove. "There you go, Princess," David Crawford said, sliding a plate of perfectly scrambled eggs in front of Lucy. His voice carried the warm tone that had first charmed her mother 2 years ago, when Rebecca was still struggling as a single parent, after Lucy's father had left them. David's smile was broad and genuine as he ruffled Lucy's dark brown hair, his hand lingering just a moment longer than necessary. "Extra cheese, just the way you like them." Lucy looked up at her stepfather with polite gratitude, though something in her stomach twisted slightly when his fingers touched her hair. David was a tall man with kind brown eyes and graying temples that made him look distinguished in his maintenance supervisor uniform. To anyone watching, he appeared to be the perfect stepfather, attentive, caring, invested in Lucy's well-being. The neighbors on Maple Street often commented to Rebecca about how lucky she was to find such a devoted man after her difficult divorce. "Thank you, David," Lucy said quietly, picking up her fork and taking a small bite. The eggs were good. David was an excellent cook, but lately she found herself less hungry when he served her meals. She could not explain why, even to herself. Rebecca Morrison Crawford moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency. Her auburn hair pulled back in a neat ponytail that would fit comfortably under her nursing cap. At 32, she still carried the grace of her younger years, though the exhaustion of working double shifts at Cedar Falls General Hospital had begun to show in the fine lines around her green eyes. She paused behind Lucy's chair to plant a quick kiss on top of her daughter's head, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. "I have to work another double tonight, sweetheart," Rebecca said, her voice carrying a note of apology. "Dr. Martinez is still out sick, and we're short-staffed in the pediatric unit. David will take good care of you, won't you, honey?" David turned from the stove, spatula still in hand, and gave Rebecca one of his most reassuring smiles. Of course. Lucy and I always have a good time together when you're at work, don't we, Princess?" His eyes found Lucy's across the kitchen, and she felt that familiar, uncomfortable flutter in her chest that she could not quite name. "Yes," Lucy said, because it was the answer that was expected of her. But as she spoke, she noticed how David's smile seemed to change when he looked at her, becoming something different than the smile he gave her mother. She was only 7, but she was observant beyond her years, a trait that both her teacher and her mother often praised her for. Cedar Falls was the kind of small Ohio town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where children could still ride their bicycles to school without their parents worrying, and where the changing of the seasons marked the passage of time, more clearly than any calendar. October had painted the maple trees in brilliant shades of orange and red, and the morning air carried the crisp promise of the winter to come. Lucy loved autumn in Cedar Falls, the way the leaves crunched under her feet as she walked to school, the smell of wood smoke from neighborhood fireplaces, and the anticipation of Halloween just around the corner. "Speaking of school," Rebecca said, glancing at the clock above the sink, "you need to finish up, Lucy. Mr. Thompson doesn't like it when students are late for morning attendance." Lucy's face brightened at the mention of her teacher. Mr. Thompson was a kind man in his 50s who wore sweater vests and had a gentle way of explaining mathematics that made even the most complicated problems seem manageable. His classroom at Cedar Falls Elementary was a sanctuary of order and learning, with its neat rows of desks, colorful educational posters covering every wall, and the comforting smell of chalk and old books. "I finished my homework last night," Lucy said, pushing her eggs around on her plate. "David helped me with the word problems in math." "He's getting so good at helping you with your studies," Rebecca said, gathering her purse and hospital badge from the counter. "I don't know what we would have done without him these past 2 years." David moved to Rebecca's side, placing a possessive hand on the small of her back as he leaned down to kiss her cheek. Lucy watched this display of affection with mixed feelings. She was happy that her mother had found someone who seemed to care for her, but there was something about the way David's hands moved, the way his eyes followed Rebecca when she was not looking, that made Lucy feel uneasy in ways she could not articulate. "Drive safely," David murmured against Rebecca's ear. "We'll miss you." "I'll miss you both too," Rebecca replied, shouldering her purse and heading toward the door. She paused to wave goodbye to Lucy, who managed a smile and a wave in return. "Be good for David, sweetheart. I'll see you in the morning." The sound of Rebecca's car pulling out of the driveway seemed to change the atmosphere in the kitchen. Lucy felt it immediately, a subtle shift in David's demeanor, as if a mask had slipped just slightly. He remained standing by the counter, watching through the window until Rebecca's blue Honda disappeared around the corner of Maple Street. "Well then," David said, turning back to Lucy with that same smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "It's just you and me again, Princess. What do you say we get you ready for school?" Lucy nodded and carried her plate to the sink, careful not to let David's hand brush against hers when he reached to take it from her. She had learned, through trial and error, that avoiding unnecessary physical contact with her stepfather made her feel safer, though she could not explain why, even to herself. The walk to Cedar Falls Elementary was only 6 blocks from their house on Maple Street, a pleasant journey through a neighborhood of similar modest homes, with well-maintained lawns and American flags hanging from front porches. Lucy usually enjoyed this walk, especially in autumn when the sidewalks were carpeted with fallen leaves and the air smelled of burning wood and distant apple cider. But walking with David always made her feel self-conscious, as if she were performing in a play where she had forgotten her lines. "Tell me about your friends at school," David said as they walked, his long strides forcing Lucy to hurry to keep up. "That little girl Emma who came for a sleepover last weekend, does she live nearby?" Lucy felt that familiar twist in her stomach when David mentioned Emma. The sleepover had been fun. They had watched movies, painted their nails, and stayed up late giggling about boys in their class. But David had seemed unusually interested in their activities, checking on them more frequently than necessary, and asking detailed questions about what they were doing, what they were wearing, and whether they needed anything. "She lives on Oak Street," Lucy said simply, not wanting to provide more information than necessary. "And her parents? What do they do for work?" David's questions felt intrusive, though Lucy could not explain why a stepfather asking about his stepdaughter's friends would be inappropriate. "Her dad works at the bank and her mom stays home," Lucy replied, relief washing over her as the red brick building of Cedar Falls Elementary came into view. The school was a comforting sight with its tall windows, flagpole, and playground, filled with the familiar sounds of children arriving for another day of learning. Cedar Falls Elementary served grades kindergarten through 5th, with about 300 students total. The building was old, but well-maintained, with wide hallways, lined with student artwork and bulletin boards celebrating various academic achievements. Lucy had attended school here since kindergarten, and she loved the predictable routine of her days. The morning pledge of allegiance, the gentle authority of Mr. Thompson's instruction, and the sense of safety that came from being surrounded by adults whose job it was to protect and educate children. As they approached the main entrance, Lucy spotted a familiar figure near the front doors. Miss Jennifer Walsh, the school counselor, was greeting students as they arrived, her warm smile and gentle demeanor making her a favorite among children and parents alike. Miss Walsh was in her late 20s, with shoulder-length blonde hair, and kind blue eyes that seemed to really see the children she spoke with. She had a gift for making every child feel heard and valued, a quality that had not gone unnoticed by Lucy during their brief interactions. "Good morning, Lucy," Miss Walsh called out, waving as they approached. "How are you doing today?" "I'm good, Miss Walsh," Lucy replied, and for the first time that morning, her smile felt genuine. There was something about Miss Walsh that made Lucy feel safe, as if she were talking to a trusted aunt rather than a school employee. "And you must be Mr. Crawford," Miss Walsh said, extending her hand to David. "I'm Jennifer Walsh, the school counselor. It's nice to finally meet you in person." David shook her hand with his most charming smile, the same one that had won over Rebecca and most of the neighbors on Maple Street. "Please call me David. Lucy has mentioned you before. She thinks very highly of you." "The feeling is mutual," Miss Walsh said, her attention returning to Lucy. "Lucy is one of our most thoughtful students. Mr. Thompson tells me she's doing excellent work in mathematics this year." Lucy felt a flush of pride at the compliment, but she noticed how David's hand came to rest on her shoulder, his fingers applying just enough pressure to remind her of his presence. It was not painful, but it was not entirely comfortable either. "We're very proud of her," David said, his voice carrying that note of parental authority that still sounded strange to Lucy's ears. "She works very hard on her homework every night." "That's wonderful to hear," Miss Walsh replied, though Lucy thought she detected something in the counselor's expression, a slight narrowing of her eyes as she observed David's hand on Lucy's shoulder. "Lucy, don't forget that my office is always open if you ever want to talk about anything. Sometimes it's nice to have someone to chat with who isn't a teacher or a parent." The word seemed deliberately chosen, and Lucy felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. Miss Walsh was offering her something, a safe space perhaps, or simply an adult who would listen without judgment. "Thank you, Miss Walsh," Lucy said, meaning it more than the counselor could possibly know. The first bell rang across the playground, signaling that students should begin making their way to their classrooms. David leaned down to give Lucy a hug goodbye, and she endured the embrace while trying not to stiffen at his touch. "Have a good day, Princess," he murmured against her hair. "I'll be here to pick you up at 3:15. Lucy nodded and hurried toward the building, relieved to be entering the familiar sanctuary of her school. She waved goodbye to David from the doorway, then turned to join the stream of children making their way through the hallways to their respective classrooms. Mr. Thompson's third-grade classroom was located on the second floor, overlooking the playground and parking lot. The room was exactly as Lucy had left it the day before, neat rows of desks facing the whiteboard, educational posters covering every available wall space, and the comforting smell of chalk and old books that seemed to permeate every corner of the building. "Good morning, Lucy," Mr. Thompson said as she entered. He was a man in his mid-50s, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, wearing one of his characteristic sweater vests over a button-down shirt. His demeanor was formal but kind, and he had a reputation for being fair and patient with his students. "I hope you're ready for our multiplication quiz this morning." "Yes, Mr. Thompson," Lucy replied, taking her seat in the third row and pulling out her pencil case. The familiar routine of preparing for class helped settle her nerves, and she felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. As her classmates filed into the room, chattering about their evening activities and weekend plans, Lucy found herself thinking about Miss Walsh's offer to talk. There was something about the school counselor that inspired trust. Perhaps it was her genuine interest in what children had to say, or the way she spoke to them as equals, rather than talking down to them the way some adults did. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm. The Pledge of Allegiance, morning announcements, and the multiplication quiz that Lucy completed with confidence, thanks to David's tutoring the night before. Despite her complicated feelings about her stepfather, she had to admit that he was genuinely helpful with her homework, patient in his explanations, and supportive of her academic success. During recess, Lucy found herself on the playground with her best friend Emma, a petite girl with curly red hair and freckles across her nose. They had been inseparable since kindergarten, sharing secrets, trading lunch items, and defending each other against the occasional playground bully. "My mom said I can have another sleepover next weekend," Emma said as they sat on the swings, gently rocking back and forth. "Do you want to come to my house this time?" Lucy felt a complicated mix of emotions at the suggestion. She loved spending time with Emma, but the idea of having Emma visit her house again made her stomach twist with anxiety. She could not explain to her friend why she preferred to have sleepovers anywhere but her own home. "That sounds fun," Lucy said, choosing her words carefully. "My mom might have to work anyway, so it would probably be better if I came to your house." Emma seemed satisfied with this response, and they moved on to other topics: the upcoming Halloween costume contest, the new boy in their class who seemed nice but shy, and their shared excitement about the autumn festival that Cedar Falls held every October in the town square. But even as Lucy laughed and chatted with her best friend, she found her gaze drifting toward the school building, wondering if Miss Walsh was in her office and whether she really meant what she had said about being available to talk. The counselor's words echoed in Lucy's mind. Sometimes it's nice to have someone to chat with who isn't a teacher or a parent. The rest of the school day passed quickly, filled with reading comprehension exercises, a science lesson about the changing seasons, and an art project that involved creating leaf rubbings with crayons and construction paper. Lucy threw herself into her work with characteristic focus, grateful for the distraction that schoolwork provided from the complicated feelings that seemed to follow her everywhere lately. At 3:15, she gathered her backpack and made her way to the front entrance where parents and guardians waited to collect their children. David was there as promised, standing near the flagpole with his hands in his pockets, watching the stream of children emerge from the building. His face lit up when he spotted Lucy, and he waved her over with the same enthusiasm he had shown that morning. "How was your day, Princess?" he asked as they began the walk home, falling into step beside her on the sidewalk. "It was good," Lucy replied, adjusting the straps of her backpack. "We had a multiplication quiz, and I think I did well." "I'm sure you did. You're such a smart girl," David said, and Lucy could hear the pride in his voice. It was confusing, this mixture of genuine care and something else that she could not quite identify. David seemed to genuinely want her to succeed, to be happy and healthy and safe. But there were moments, like when his hand lingered too long on her shoulder, or when he asked too many questions about her friends, that made her feel uncomfortable in ways she could not articulate. As they walked down Maple Street toward their house, David continued his usual pattern of questions about her day. Who had she sat with at lunch? What had she and Emma talked about during recess? Had any boys in her class been paying attention to her? The questions felt invasive, though Lucy could not explain why a stepfather's interest in his stepdaughter's social life would be inappropriate. Their house came into view, a modest two-story structure with white siding and blue shutters, surrounded by a small yard that David kept meticulously maintained. There was a detached garage where David kept his tools and workshop supplies, and a basement that he had claimed as his private workspace when he moved in 2 years ago. Lucy was not allowed in the basement. David had made that rule very clear from the beginning, explaining that it contained dangerous tools and chemicals that could hurt a child. "Why don't you go upstairs and get started on your homework?" David suggested as they entered through the front door. "I'll make us a snack and bring it up to you." Lucy nodded and climbed the stairs to her bedroom, grateful for a few moments of privacy. Her room was her sanctuary, painted in her favorite shade of lavender, with white furniture and stuffed animals arranged on every available surface. Her cat, Whiskers, was curled up on her bed, and he lifted his head to greet her with a soft meow. "Hey, Whiskers," Lucy said, dropping her backpack by her desk and settling onto the bed to scratch behind the cat's ears. Whiskers was a gray and white tabby that Rebecca had adopted from the animal shelter for Lucy's 6th birthday. He was affectionate and playful, though lately Lucy had noticed that he seemed nervous around David, often hiding under furniture, when her stepfather was in the room. As Lucy pulled out her homework and spread it across her desk, she could hear David moving around downstairs, The sound of the refrigerator opening and closing, the microwave beeping, and his footsteps as he moved through the kitchen. Soon, she heard him climbing the stairs, and she felt that familiar flutter of anxiety in her stomach. "Here we go," David said, entering her room without knocking and setting down a plate of apple slices and peanut butter. "Your favorite afternoon snack." "Thank you," Lucy said, not looking up from her mathematics worksheet. She had learned that maintaining focus on her homework helped discourage David from lingering in her room. But instead of leaving, David sat down on the edge of her bed, making the mattress dip under his weight. "You know, Lucy, I hope you feel comfortable talking to me about anything that might be bothering you. I know I'm not your real father, but I care about you very much, and I want you to feel safe and happy in our home." Lucy looked up at him, studying his face for any sign of insincerity. His expression seemed genuine, and his words were exactly what a caring stepfather should say. But something about the way he was looking at her, the way his presence seemed to fill her room and make it feel smaller, made her want to retreat. "I do feel safe," she said, because it was the answer he wanted to hear. "And happy." "Good," David said, reaching out to brush a strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was gentle, but Lucy had to resist the urge to pull away. "You're such a special girl, Lucy. So smart and beautiful. I feel very lucky to be part of your life." There was something about the way he said beautiful that made Lucy's skin crawl, though she could not explain why. She was only 7 years old, and the concept of inappropriate adult attention was beyond her understanding. All she knew was that David's compliments made her feel uncomfortable rather than proud. "I should finish my homework," Lucy said, turning back to her worksheet and hoping he would take the hint. "Of course," David said, standing up from the bed. "I'll let you concentrate. But remember what I said. You can always come to me if you need anything. Anything at all." After he left, closing the door behind him, Lucy sat at her desk for a long moment without touching her pencil. Whiskers jumped down from the bed and rubbed against her legs, purring softly. She reached down to pet him, finding comfort in his warm, solid presence. Something was wrong. Lucy could not name it or explain it, but she could feel it in her bones, the way she could sense a storm coming before the first clouds appeared in the sky. David was kind to her, helpful with her homework, and clearly devoted to her mother. He had never hurt her or said anything obviously inappropriate. But there was something in the way he looked at her, something in the questions he asked, and the way his hands seemed to find excuses to touch her that made her feel like a small animal being watched by a predator. As she worked on her mathematics problems, Lucy found herself thinking about Miss Walsh's words from that morning. The school counselor had seemed to really see her, to understand that sometimes children needed someone to talk to who was not a parent or teacher. The offer had felt genuine, and Lucy wondered if Miss Walsh would believe her if she tried to explain the feelings she could not quite put into words. Outside her bedroom window, the afternoon sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that matched the autumn leaves on the maple tree in their front yard. Soon, Rebecca would come home from her double shift, exhausted but smiling, and the house would feel normal again. David's attention would shift to his wife, and Lucy would be able to retreat to her room and her homework and her cat without feeling like she was constantly being observed. But Rebecca would have to work another double shift tomorrow night, and the night after that. Dr. Martinez was still sick, and the pediatric unit was short-staffed. Lucy would be alone with David again, navigating the complicated feelings that she could not name and trying to understand why a man who seemed to care about her made her feel so deeply uncomfortable. As she finished her mathematics worksheet and moved on to her reading assignment, Lucy made a decision. Tomorrow, during recess, she would find Miss Walsh and see if the counselor's offer to talk was genuine. She might not be able to explain exactly what was wrong, but perhaps Miss Walsh would understand the feelings that Lucy could not put into words. The sound of David's footsteps in the hallway below reminded Lucy that she was not truly alone. that she was being watched and monitored, even when she could not see him. She pulled Whiskers onto her lap and buried her face in his soft fur, wishing she could fast forward through the evening hours until her mother came home and the house felt safe again. But for now, all she could do was finish her homework, eat her dinner, and try to avoid spending any more time alone with the man who was supposed to protect her, but instead made her feel like she needed protection from him. The following week brought a pattern that Lucy was beginning to recognize with growing dread. Rebecca's double shifts at Cedar Falls General Hospital had become more frequent as Dr. Martinez's illness stretched into its second week, leaving Lucy alone with David most evenings. Each time her mother kissed her goodbye and headed out into the darkness, Lucy felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach, a sense of unease that seemed to intensify with each passing day. It was Thursday evening when the uncomfortable feeling that had been building for days finally crystallized into something Lucy could almost name. Rebecca had left for work at 6 o'clock, her nursing bag slung over her shoulder, and exhaustion already evident in the lines around her eyes. David had prepared dinner, spaghetti with meat sauce, one of Lucy's favorites, and they had eaten together at the kitchen table while the autumn wind rattled the windows of their house on Maple Street. "You're very quiet tonight, Princess," David observed, as Lucy pushed the pasta around on her plate without much enthusiasm. "Everything okay at school?" Lucy looked up from her dinner, studying David's face in the warm glow of the kitchen light. To anyone else, he would have appeared to be the picture of a concerned stepfather, his expression gentle, his voice filled with what seemed like genuine care for her well-being. But Lucy had learned to read the subtle signs that others missed, the way his eyes lingered on her face just a moment too long, the slight shift in his posture when they were alone together, the questions that probed deeper than casual interest. Warranted. "I'm fine," Lucy said, taking a small bite of spaghetti to avoid further questions. "Just tired, I guess." "You've been working very hard on your schoolwork lately," David said, twirling pasta around his fork with practiced ease. "Mr. Thompson seems very pleased with your progress in mathematics. Maybe this weekend we could do something fun together. Just the two of us. Your mother will probably have to work again, so we'll have plenty of time." The suggestion made Lucy's stomach clench, though she could not explain why the prospect of spending more time with David filled her with such anxiety. He was always kind to her, always patient with her homework, always ready with snacks and encouragement. Yet something about his attention felt heavy, suffocating, like a blanket that was too warm on a summer night. "Maybe," Lucy said non-committally, focusing her attention on her dinner plate. After they finished eating, David insisted on helping Lucy with her homework, as had become his custom. They sat together at the kitchen table while Lucy worked through her reading comprehension worksheet, David's chair positioned just close enough that she could smell his cologne and feel the warmth radiating from his body. Every few minutes, he would lean over to check her progress, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder or the back of her chair, his presence looming over her in a way that made it difficult to concentrate. "You're such a smart girl," David murmured, as Lucy correctly answered a question about the main character's motivation in the story they had been reading. "I'm so proud of how hard you work. You're going to grow up to be a very special young woman." The way he said "young woman" made Lucy's skin crawl, though she could not articulate why. She was only 7 years old, hardly a young woman by any definition. But something about David's tone suggested he was seeing her as something other than the child she was. "I think I understand the homework now," Lucy said, closing her workbook and gathering her papers. "Maybe I should go upstairs and finish it in my room." "Of course," David said. But instead of moving his chair back to give her space, he remained where he was, forcing Lucy to squeeze past him to reach the stairs. As she did, his hand brushed against her arm in what might have been an accident, but felt deliberately planned. Upstairs in her bedroom, Lucy tried to focus on the remainder of her homework, but her mind kept wandering to the uncomfortable interaction in the kitchen. Whiskers was curled up on her bed, his gray and white fur gleaming in the light from her desk lamp. Lately, She had noticed that her cat seemed as uncomfortable around David as she did, often hiding under her bed or in her closet when her stepfather was in the room. "At least I'm not imagining it," Lucy whispered to Whiskers, who lifted his head and regarded her with knowing green eyes. "You don't like him either, do you?" As if in response to her question, Whiskers' ears suddenly perked up, and he jumped down from the bed to stand by her bedroom door. Lucy could hear footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate steps that paused outside her room. She held her breath, waiting to see if David would knock, but after a long moment, the footsteps continued down the hall toward the master bedroom. The incident left Lucy feeling rattled and hyper-aware of every sound in the house. She could hear David moving around downstairs, the television turning on, the refrigerator opening and closing, and what sounded like papers rustling in the basement. The basement was David's domain, a space he had claimed when he moved in 2 years ago and had declared off-limits to both Lucy and Rebecca. He explained that it contained dangerous tools and chemicals from his work as a maintenance supervisor, and that it would not be safe for a child to explore. But tonight, as Lucy sat at her desk trying to finish her homework, she could hear unusual sounds coming from below. Not the typical noises of woodworking or home repair that David claimed to be doing down there, but something else. The mechanical whir of what might have been an old printer, the shuffling of papers, and occasionally what sounded like David talking to himself in low, indistinct murmurs. Curiosity overcame her anxiety, and Lucy found herself tiptoeing to her bedroom door and pressing her ear against the wood. The sounds were definitely coming from the basement, rhythmic and purposeful, as if David were working on some kind of project that required great concentration. She wondered what could possibly keep him occupied down there for hours at a time, especially since she had never seen any evidence of the woodworking projects he claimed to be pursuing. A sudden creaking sound in the hallway made Lucy jump back from the door, her heart racing with the fear of being caught eavesdropping. She quickly returned to her desk and picked up her pencil, pretending to be absorbed in her homework just in case David decided to check on her again. The next morning brought the familiar comfort of the school routine, and Lucy found herself looking forward to the walk to Cedar Falls Elementary with an eagerness that surprised her. Anything was better than remaining in the house with David, even the chilly October air that made her breath visible in small puffs as they made their way down Maple Street. "You seem much more cheerful this morning," David observed as they walked, his long strides forcing Lucy to hurry to keep pace. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes," Lucy lied, not wanting to admit that she had lain awake for hours listening to the strange sounds coming from the basement and jumping at every creak and groan of the old house settling on its foundation. "Good. Growing girls need their rest," David said, and again, something about his tone made Lucy feel uncomfortable. The way he emphasized growing girls seemed to carry implications that she was too young to understand, but old enough to find disturbing. At school, Lucy threw herself into her classwork with renewed focus, grateful for the predictable structure of Mr. Thompson's lessons and the comfortable familiarity of her classroom routine. During morning recess, she found herself scanning the playground for any sign of Miss Walsh, remembering the counselor's kind offer to talk whenever Lucy needed someone to listen. She spotted Miss Walsh near the school entrance, greeting a group of kindergarten students who were returning from a nature walk around the school grounds. The counselor was crouched down to their eye level, listening attentively as one little boy excitedly described the different types of leaves he had collected. Her genuine interest in what the children had to say, her patient way of responding to their questions, reminded Lucy why she had felt so immediately drawn to her. "Miss Walsh," Lucy called out, approaching the group with careful steps. "Lucy." Miss Walsh's face lit up with a warm smile. "How are you doing today, sweetheart?" "I'm okay," Lucy said, though the words felt inadequate to describe the complicated mix of emotions she had been experiencing lately. "I was wondering, did you mean what you said yesterday? About being able to talk to you?" Miss Walsh's expression grew more serious, and she gently guided Lucy a few steps away from the kindergarten students. "Of course I meant it. Is there Something on your mind that you'd like to discuss? Lucy felt a flutter of hope mixed with anxiety. She wanted desperately to confide in someone about the feelings she could not name, the growing sense that something was not right in her home. But how could she explain David's behavior when he had never actually done anything obviously wrong? How could she articulate the discomfort she felt when he was nothing but kind and helpful on the surface? Maybe, Lucy said carefully. But I'm not sure how to… what if something feels wrong but you can't really explain why? Miss Walsh's eyes sharpened with interest and concern. Sometimes our feelings are trying to tell us something important, even when we can't put those feelings into words. Would you like to come to my office during lunch today? We could have a quiet conversation, just the two of us. Yes, Lucy said quickly, relief flooding through her. I would like that very much. Wonderful. My office is on the first floor, right next to the library. Do you know where that is? Lucy nodded eagerly. She had passed Miss Walsh's office many times, but had never had a reason to visit. The prospect of having a safe space to voice her concerns, even if she could not fully articulate them, felt like a lifeline being thrown to a drowning person. The rest of the morning passed slowly, with Lucy's attention divided between Mr. Thompson's social studies lesson and her anticipation of her lunch meeting with Miss Walsh. She found herself rehearsing what she might say, trying to find words, for feelings that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of her 7-year-old vocabulary. When the lunch bell finally rang, Lucy gathered her things and made her way through the crowded hallways to the first floor. Miss Walsh's office was exactly where she had said it would be. A small but welcoming room with soft lighting, comfortable, chairs and walls decorated with cheerful posters about friendship, kindness, and standing up for yourself. Come in, Lucy, Miss Walsh said, gesturing to one of the child-sized chairs arranged around a low table. Would you like some juice? I have apple and orange. Apple, please, Lucy said, settling into the chair and accepting the small cup that Miss Walsh offered her. The simple act of being served refreshments made her feel valued and cared for in a way that contrasted sharply with the growing tension she felt at home. Now then, Miss Walsh said, taking a seat across from Lucy and giving her complete attention. You mentioned that something feels wrong, but you're not sure how to explain it. Sometimes it helps to just start talking, even if the words don't come out exactly right at first. Lucy took a sip of her apple juice, gathering her courage. It's about my stepfather, she said finally. David, he's very nice to me. He helps with my homework and makes good food, and my mom really loves him. But, Miss Walsh prompted gently when Lucy's words trailed off. But he makes me feel uncomfortable sometimes. Not because he's mean or anything. He's never mean. But the way he looks at me, and the questions he asks, and… Lucy struggled to find the right words. When my mom's not home, he acts different, like he's watching me all the time. Miss Walsh nodded encouragingly, her expression serious but not alarmed. Can you tell me more about how he acts different? He asks a lot of questions about my friends, Lucy said, the words coming more easily now that she had begun. Like really detailed questions about Emma and where she lives and what her parents do. And when Emma came for a sleepover last weekend, he kept checking on us. More than he needed to. He wanted to know what we were wearing to bed and if we needed help getting changed. I see, Miss Walsh said quietly. And how did that make you feel? Scared, Lucy admitted. Not scared like he was going to hurt us, but scared like something wasn't right about it. And he touches me more when my mom's not there. Not in a bad way, she added quickly. Just his hands on my shoulders, or brushing my hair back, or sitting really close when he helps with homework. It makes my stomach feel funny. Miss Walsh was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing her words carefully. Lucy, I want you to know that you're very brave for telling me about this. Sometimes when something doesn't feel right, it's because our instincts are trying to protect us. It's important to listen to those feelings. But what if I'm wrong? Lucy asked. What if he's just trying to be nice, and I'm being mean by not liking it? You're not being mean, Miss Walsh said firmly. You have every right to feel comfortable, in your own home and with the adults who are supposed to take care of you. If someone's behavior makes you uncomfortable, that's important information, even if that person seems nice on the surface. Lucy felt a rush of validation that was both relieving and frightening. Part of her had hoped that Miss Walsh would tell her she was imagining things, that David's behavior was perfectly normal stepfather behavior. But the counselor's serious attention to her concerns confirmed that her instincts might be right, that something really was wrong. What should I do? Lucy asked. For now, I want you to keep trusting your instincts, Miss Walsh said. If you ever feel unsafe or uncomfortable, you can always come find me. And if anything happens that makes you feel scared or worried, I want you to tell me right away. Can you promise me that? Yes, Lucy said, meaning it completely. Good. And Lucy, you're not alone in this. There are adults here who care about you and want to keep you safe. Don't ever forget that. As Lucy walked back to her classroom, she felt both lighter and more burdened than she had before her conversation with Miss Walsh. The counselor had taken her seriously, had validated her feelings and made her feel less alone. But she had also confirmed that Lucy's instincts were worth trusting, which meant that the uncomfortable feelings she had been experiencing were probably grounded in reality. The rest of the school day passed in a blur of lessons and activities, but Lucy found herself paying closer attention to her surroundings, to the way the adults in her life interacted with her and the other children. Mr. Thompson was kind, but maintained appropriate boundaries. He never touched students unnecessarily, never asked personal questions that seemed intrusive, never made comments about their appearance that felt inappropriate. The contrast with David's behavior was becoming more and more apparent. When 3:15 arrived and Lucy saw David waiting by the flagpole, she felt her stomach clench with the familiar anxiety that had become her constant companion. But armed with Miss Walsh's validation and the knowledge that she had an ally at school, Lucy felt slightly less powerless than she had that morning. How was your day, Princess? David asked, as they began the walk home, his tone as warm and caring as ever. It was good, Lucy replied, but this time she was more aware of the weight behind his seemingly innocent questions. Did you spend time with any friends today? That girl Emma, perhaps? We played together at recess, Lucy said, offering as little detail as possible. She's such a sweet girl, David continued. Very pretty, too. You're both growing up so fast. Before you know it, you'll be young ladies instead of little girls. The comment sent a chill through Lucy that she could not ignore. Miss Walsh's words echoed in her mind. Trust your instincts. Pay attention to how someone's behavior makes you feel. And right now, David's comment about her and Emma growing up made her feel deeply uncomfortable. That evening, as Rebecca prepared to leave for another double shift, Lucy found herself wanting to beg her mother not to go. The prospect of spending another night alone with David felt overwhelming, especially now that her conversation with Miss Walsh had brought her fears into sharper focus. Be good for David, Rebecca said, kissing Lucy's forehead before heading toward the door. I'll see you in the morning, sweetheart. After Rebecca left, the house seemed to take on a different atmosphere, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. David moved through his evening routine, cleaning up the kitchen, checking the doors and windows, settling in front of the television with a cup of coffee. But Lucy noticed things she had missed before, the way his eyes followed her when she moved through the room, the casual questions about whether she had taken her bath yet, the suggestion that maybe she was getting too old to bathe by herself. I can take a bath by myself, Lucy said firmly, surprised by her own boldness. David looked momentarily taken aback by her tone, but his smile never wavered. Of course you can, Princess. I just want to make sure you're safe. That bathroom can be slippery when it's wet. I'll be careful, Lucy said, already heading toward the stairs. As she climbed to the second floor, Lucy could feel David's eyes on her back. and she quickened her pace until she reached the safety of her bedroom. Whiskers was waiting for her on the bed, and she gathered him into her arms, taking comfort in his warm, solid presence. "I talked to Miss Walsh today," she whispered to the cat. "She believes me. She thinks something's wrong, too." As if in response to her words, Whiskers suddenly tensed in her arms, his ears flattening against his head. Lucy followed his gaze toward her bedroom door and realized that the sounds from the basement had started again, the mechanical whirring, the shuffling of papers, and David's low voice murmuring words she could not make out. But tonight, there was something else. A sound that made her blood run cold, though she could not immediately identify what it was. It sounded almost like crying. Very faint, very distant, but unmistakably the sound of someone in distress. Lucy crept to her bedroom door and pressed her ear against the wood, straining to hear more clearly. The basement sounds continued, the printer, the papers, David's voice. But underneath it all was that thin thread of sound that might have been sobbing. She pulled back from the door, her heart racing with a fear that went beyond anything she had experienced before. Whatever David was doing in the basement, it was not woodworking. And if someone was crying down there, the realization hit her like a physical blow. She was not the only one who felt uncomfortable around David. She might not be the only child whose instincts were telling her that something was terribly wrong. Lucy spent the rest of the evening in her room, too frightened to venture downstairs, even for a glass of water. When she finally fell asleep, it was with Whiskers curled protectively against her chest and her bedroom door firmly closed. But even in sleep, she could not escape the echo of that distant crying, or the growing certainty that whatever was happening in her house, it was far worse than anything she had imagined. Tomorrow, she decided as she drifted off to sleep, she would talk to Miss Walsh again. And this time she would find a way to tell her about the sounds from the basement, even if she could not fully explain what they meant. Because Lucy was beginning to understand that her safety, and possibly the safety of others, might depend on finding the courage to speak up about things that adults would rather not hear. Friday night arrived with an ominous weight that Lucy could feel settling in her chest as soon as Rebecca began gathering her things for another double shift at Cedar Falls General Hospital. The autumn wind howled around the corners of their house on Maple Street, rattling the windows and sending dried leaves skittering across the front porch like tiny claws scratching against wood. Lucy sat at the kitchen table, mechanically eating the grilled cheese sandwich that David had prepared for dinner, but every bite felt like sand in her mouth. "Dr. Martinez is still out sick," Rebecca said, checking her reflection in the hallway mirror as she prepared to leave. Dark circles under her eyes spoke to the exhaustion that had become her constant companion over the past few weeks. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I know you don't like it when I have to work so many nights in a row." Lucy wanted to tell her mother that it was not the nights alone that frightened her. It was the nights alone with David. But the words stuck in her throat, weighed down by the complexity of emotions she still could not fully articulate. How could she explain that the man her mother loved and trusted made her feel like a mouse being watched by a hawk? "It's okay, Mom," Lucy said instead, managing a smile that felt as fragile as glass. "I understand." David moved up behind Rebecca, placing his hands on her shoulders in what appeared to be a gesture of comfort and support. But Lucy noticed how his fingers seemed to linger, how his touch appeared possessive rather than caring, and how his eyes found Lucy's across the kitchen, while his hands remained on her mother's body. "Don't worry about us," David said, his voice carrying that warm, reassuring tone that had once made Lucy feel safe, but now made her skin crawl. "Lucy and I always have a good time together, don't we, Princess?" "Yes," Lucy replied automatically, though the word felt like a lie on her tongue. After Rebecca left, her taillights disappearing into the darkness beyond Maple Street, the house seemed to exhale slowly, as if it too were holding its breath in anticipation of what the evening might bring. David moved through his usual routine of cleaning up the kitchen and checking the locks on the doors, But Lucy noticed that his movements seemed more purposeful tonight, as if he were preparing for something specific. "Why don't you go upstairs? I can get ready for bed," David suggested, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp, with an intensity that made Lucy's stomach flutter with anxiety. "I'll be up in a little while to check on you." The prospect of David checking on her made Lucy's heart race with fear she could not name. Over the past few days, his bedtime visits had become longer and more intrusive, filled with questions about her body, her developing friendship with Emma, and whether she had any questions about growing up that she wanted to discuss with him. "I can get ready by myself," Lucy said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. David's smile flickered for just a moment, revealing something cold beneath the surface. "Of course you can, Princess. But I like to make sure you're safe and comfortable. That's what good fathers do." The word fathers hung in the air between them like a challenge. David was not her father, would never be her father, no matter how much her mother loved him. And something about the way he claimed that title, the possessiveness in his voice when he said it, made Lucy feel sick to her stomach. Upstairs in her bedroom, Lucy went through the motions of her bedtime routine with mechanical precision. She brushed her teeth, washed her face, and changed into her pajamas. A simple set of cotton pants and a long-sleeved shirt that covered her completely. Lately, she had found herself choosing sleepwear that revealed as little skin as possible, though she could not explain why this felt important. Whiskers was waiting for her on the bed, his green eyes bright with what seemed like concern. The cat had been acting strangely all week, spending more time in Lucy's room and less time exploring the rest of the house. It was as if he too sensed that something was wrong, that the familiar sanctuary of their home had become a place where danger lurked in the shadows. "I wish you could talk," Lucy whispered to Whiskers, scratching behind his ears and taking comfort in his rumbling purr. "I wish you could tell me what you think about David." As if summoned by her words, the sound of David's footsteps echoed in the hallway outside her room. Lucy tensed, pulling Whiskers closer to her chest and waiting to see if her stepfather would knock on her door. The footsteps paused outside her room for what felt like an eternity, and Lucy held her breath, praying that he would continue on to his own bedroom. But instead of knocking, the footsteps moved past her door and continued down the hall toward the stairs. Lucy heard the basement door creak open, followed by the sound of David's heavy tread on the wooden steps that led down into his forbidden domain. Within minutes, the familiar sounds began. The mechanical whirring of the old printer, the shuffling of papers, and David's voice murmuring words that Lucy could not quite make out. But tonight, there was something different about the sounds, something more urgent and focused that made the hair on the back of Lucy's neck stand on end. And then she heard it again. The sound that had haunted her dreams for the past 2 nights. Crying, soft, muffled, but unmistakably the sound of someone in distress. The sound seemed to be coming from the basement, mixed in with the mechanical noises and David's low voice. Lucy sat frozen on her bed, Whiskers tense in her arms, as the horrible realization washed over her. Someone was down there with David. Someone who was crying, someone who was scared, someone who might need help. The sound of crying grew louder, more desperate, and Lucy felt her fear transform into something else, a fierce determination that surprised her with its intensity. Miss Walsh had told her to trust her instincts, to speak up when something felt wrong. But what if speaking up was not enough? What if someone needed help right now, tonight, and Lucy was the only one who could provide it? She waited until the ow sounds from the basement settled into their usual rhythm, then carefully placed Whiskers on the bed and crept to her bedroom door. The hallway was dark and quiet, illuminated only by the faint glow of the nightlight that Rebecca had installed. Years ago when Lucy was afraid of the dark. Now, the darkness felt like a friend, offering concealment as she made her way toward the stairs. The basement door stood slightly ajar, and a thin line of light leaked through the crack into the hallway. Lucy could hear David moving around below, his footsteps heavy on the concrete floor, punctuated by the sounds of papers rustling and what might have been drawers opening and closing. But underneath it all was that thread of crying, thin and desperate, like the sound of a wounded animal trapped in a cage. Lucy knew she should go back to her room, should wait until morning and tell Miss Walsh about what she had heard. But the crying seemed to be getting weaker, more desperate, and she could not shake the feeling that waiting might be too late for whoever was down there. Taking a deep breath, Lucy pushed the basement door open just wide enough to slip through and began her descent down the wooden steps. Each step seemed to echo like thunder in her ears, and she paused frequently to listen for any sign that David had heard her. But the sounds from below continued unchanged, the printer, the papers, and his low voice murmuring what sounded like instructions or commands. The basement was larger than Lucy had imagined, stretching out beyond the circle of light cast by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air smelled of dampness and chemicals, with an underlying odor that made her nose wrinkle in disgust. David's workbench dominated one corner of the space, covered with what appeared to be photographs spread out in neat rows like a macabre display. But it was not the photographs that made Lucy's blood run cold. It was the sound of Whiskers meowing frantically from somewhere in the darkness beyond the workbench. Her cat was down here, trapped or hiding, and his distressed cries were mingling with the human sobbing that had drawn her downstairs in the first place. Lucy crept toward the sound of Whiskers' cries, moving carefully to avoid the squeaky spots on the concrete floor that might alert David to her presence. As she rounded the corner of the workbench, she could see her cat crouched behind a stack of cardboard boxes, his fur standing on end and his eyes wide with fear. "Whiskers," Lucy whispered, reaching for her cat. "What are you doing down here?" As she lifted Whiskers into her arms, her shoulder bumped against one of the cardboard boxes, and she felt it shift precariously on its stack. Time seemed to slow, as the box tilted, teetered, and then tumbled to the floor with a crash that echoed through the basement like a gunshot. Photographs scattered across the concrete in a fan of black and white images that made Lucy's world tilt on its axis. Even in the dim light, she could see enough to understand that these were not normal family photographs or pictures from David's work. These were images of children, children sleeping, children undressing, children in moments of vulnerability and privacy that should never have been captured on film. And there, among the scattered photographs, Lucy saw her own face staring back at her. Picture after picture of herself, sleeping in her bed, changing clothes in her room, stepping out of the bath, all taken without her knowledge or consent. There were photographs of Emma, too, from their sleepover the weekend before, images that made Lucy's stomach turn with a sickness that went beyond physical nausea. But it was not just pictures of her and Emma. There were other children, too, faces she recognized from school, from the neighborhood, from the playground at Cedar Falls Elementary. Children who had visited their house for playdates or birthday parties. Children whose parents trusted David. Children who had no idea that their most private moments had been violated and preserved in these horrible images. Lucy's hand shook as she gathered up several of the photographs, her 7-year-old mind struggling to process what she was seeing, but understanding on some instinctive level that this was wrong, profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. These pictures were evidence of something evil, something that needed to be stopped, something that adults needed to know about immediately. The sound of David's footsteps moving across the basement floor made Lucy's heart stop. He was coming, toward her, drawn by the sound of the falling box, and she had only seconds to act before he discovered her in his forbidden sanctuary. Moving purely on instinct, Lucy stuffed several of the most disturbing photographs into the pocket of her pajama top, grabbed Whiskers, and began moving toward the stairs as quickly and quietly as she could manage. Behind her, she could hear David's voice calling out, sharp with suspicion and anger. "Who's down there? Lucy! Lucy, is that you?" Lucy reached the stairs just as David rounded the corner of his workbench, his face a mask of fury that transformed his familiar features into something monstrous. For a moment, their eyes met across the basement, and Lucy saw something in David's expression that made her understand, with crystal clarity, exactly how much danger she was in. "I was just getting whiskers," Lucy said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "He was crying, and I thought he might be hurt." David's expression shifted, the mask of concerned stepfather sliding back into place so smoothly that Lucy might have thought she had imagined the fury if not for the photographs hidden in her pocket. "Whiskers shouldn't be down here, Princess. It's not safe for cats, or for little girls." The threat in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. Lucy clutched Whiskers tighter to her chest and took another step toward the stairs. "I'm sorry, I'll take him upstairs now." "That's a good idea," David said, moving closer with each word. "And Lucy, let's keep this between us, shall we? Your mother has enough to worry about without knowing that you've been disobeying the rules about the basement." Lucy nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and hurried up the stairs with Whiskers purring frantically in her arms. Behind her, she could hear David beginning to clean up the scattered photographs, and she knew that by morning, any evidence of what she had seen would be carefully hidden away again. In her bedroom, Lucy closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding so hard that she could hear it in her ears. Whiskers jumped down from her arms and immediately began washing himself with the frantic intensity of a cat who had been through a traumatic experience. With shaking hands, Lucy pulled the photographs from her pajama pocket and spread them out on her bed. Even in the soft light of her bedside lamp, the images were clear enough to make her stomach churn with revulsion. These were not the confused feelings and uncomfortable moments she had tried to describe to Miss Walsh. This was concrete evidence of something terrible, something that proved her instincts had been right all along. Lucy gathered the photographs and slipped them into her school backpack, which was sitting by her desk ready for Monday morning. Miss Walsh had told her to come find her if anything happened that made her feel scared or worried. Well, Lucy was more than scared now. She was terrified. But she was also determined. These photographs were proof that David was not the man her mother thought he was, and Miss Walsh would know what to do with that proof. As she settled into bed with Whiskers, curled protectively against her side, Lucy could hear David moving around downstairs, his footsteps heavy with what might have been anger or anxiety. She knew that he was probably checking and double-checking his hiding places, making sure that nothing else was out of place in his basement sanctuary. But he did not know about the photographs in her backpack. He did not know that his secret was no longer safe, that a 7-year-old girl with more courage than fear had taken the evidence that would finally expose him for what he really was. Lucy lay awake for most of the night, listening to every sound in the house and jumping at every creak and groan of the old building settling on its foundation. Whiskers remained pressed against her side, as if he too understood that they were no longer safe in the place they had once called home. When she finally fell asleep in the early hours of the morning, Lucy's dreams were filled with images of photographs and basements and crying that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. But underneath the fear and horror was a thread of determination that grew stronger with each passing hour. Monday morning could not come soon enough. Lucy had evidence now, real concrete proof of David's crimes, and Miss Walsh would know what to do with it. The adults would finally listen, would finally understand that the danger Lucy had sensed was real and immediate, and far worse than anyone had imagined. She was no longer just a little girl with uncomfortable feelings she could not explain. She was a witness, a survivor, and soon she would be the voice that brought David's reign of terror to an end. The photographs hidden in her backpack seemed to pulse with their own dark energy. But Lucy drew strength from their presence. Tomorrow, she would show them to Miss Walsh. Tomorrow she would find the courage to speak the truth that would finally set her free. Outside her bedroom window, the first gray light of dawn was beginning to creep across the October sky, and with it came the promise that this nightmare would soon be over. Lucy closed her eyes and held Whiskers close, counting down the hours, until she could walk through the doors of Cedar Falls Elementary and place her terrible burden in the hands of someone who would know how to carry it. The crying she had heard in the basement still echoed in her memory, but now it was mixed with something else, the sound of her own voice, growing stronger and more determined with each passing moment. She would not let David hurt anyone else. She would not let his secrets remain hidden in the darkness. Monday morning would bring justice, and Lucy Morrison would be the one to deliver it. Monday morning arrived with the pale, cold light of late October filtering through Lucy's bedroom. Curtains. She had barely slept, her body rigid with tension, and her mind racing with images of the photographs hidden in her school backpack. Every sound in the house, the settling of old wood, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant hum of the refrigerator, made her heart skip with the fear that David might be coming to check on her, might somehow know what she had discovered. In his basement sanctuary, Whiskers had remained pressed against her side throughout the long night, his warm body providing the only comfort Lucy could find in the darkness. The cat seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed in their world, that the house on Maple Street was no longer the safe haven it had once appeared to be. When Rebecca's alarm clock began its shrill cry at 6:30, Lucy felt a mixture of relief and terror wash over her. The night was over, but now she had to face David across the breakfast table, had to pretend that nothing had changed while the evidence of his crimes sat waiting in her backpack like a ticking bomb. The sound of the shower running in her mother's bathroom meant that Rebecca was preparing for another day at Cedar Falls General Hospital, oblivious to the horror that had been unfolding under her own roof. Lucy wanted desperately to run to her mother, to pour out everything she had discovered and beg Rebecca to make it all stop. But something held her back. The knowledge that Rebecca loved David, trusted him completely, and might not believe what Lucy had to tell her. Miss Walsh would believe her. Miss Walsh had already proven that she took Lucy's concerns seriously, had validated her feelings and encouraged her to trust her instincts. And now Lucy had more than instincts. She had proof. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Lucy stiffen with anxiety. A gentle knock on her bedroom door was followed by Rebecca's voice, warm with maternal affection but edged with the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. "Lucy, sweetheart, time to get up for school." "I'm awake, Mom," Lucy called back, surprised by how normal her own voice sounded, despite the chaos of emotions churning in her chest. "David's making pancakes for breakfast," Rebecca said through the door. "Your favorite." The thought of sitting across from David, of pretending to enjoy his cooking while the photographs burned like acid in her backpack, made Lucy's stomach twist with nausea. But she knew she had to maintain the facade for just a few more hours, had to get through breakfast and the walk to school without arousing his suspicion. "I'll be down in a few minutes," Lucy said, already climbing out of bed and reaching for the clothes she had laid out the night before. Getting dressed felt like putting on armor for battle. Lucy chose her most comfortable jeans and a thick sweater that made her feel protected and concealed. She brushed her teeth and hair with mechanical precision, avoiding her own eyes in the bathroom mirror because she was afraid of what she might see there. Fear, determination, or the terrible knowledge that separated her from the innocent child she had been just days before. Her backpack sat by her desk, ordinary and unassuming, giving no hint of the explosive evidence it contained. Lucy double-checked that the photographs were still safely tucked into the front pocket, then slung the bag over her shoulder and headed downstairs to face the most difficult performance of her young life. The kitchen smelled of butter and maple, syrup, warm and inviting in a way that would have been comforting under different circumstances. David stood at the stove, a spatula in his hand and a smile on his face that looked exactly the same as it had every other morning. But Lucy now knew that smile for what it was, a mask hiding something monstrous underneath. "Good morning, Princess," David said, turning to look at her with those familiar brown eyes that had once seemed kind but now made her skin crawl. "I made your favorite pancakes. Blueberry, just the way you like them." "Thank you," Lucy managed, taking her seat at the kitchen table and trying to ignore the way David's gaze seemed to linger on her face, as if he were searching for some sign that she remembered what had happened in the basement. Rebecca bustled around the kitchen, gathering her things for work and stealing bites of pancake between sips of coffee. She seemed completely oblivious to the tension crackling in the air between Lucy and David, focused instead on the demands of her job and the logistics of another long day at the hospital. "I might have to work late again tonight," Rebecca said, kissing the top of Lucy's head as she passed behind her chair. "The flu is going around the pediatric ward, and we're short-staffed. You'll be okay with David, won't you, sweetheart?" The thought of spending another evening alone with David, knowing what she now knew about him, made Lucy's blood turn to ice in her veins. But by tonight, everything would be different. By tonight, Miss Walsh would have seen the photographs, would have called the police, would have made sure that David could never hurt anyone again. "I'll be fine," Lucy said, and this time she meant it. Because she would not be coming home to this house tonight, would not be sitting at this table pretending that everything was normal while a predator watched her every move. David set a plate of pancakes in front of her, and Lucy forced herself to take a bite, chewing mechanically and swallowing despite the nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. The pancakes tasted like sawdust in her mouth, but she managed to eat enough to avoid suspicion while David and Rebecca chatted about their respective plans for the day. "I'll walk Lucy to school," David said, as he had every morning for the past 2 years. But today, the offer sounded like a threat, and Lucy had to resist the urge to tell her mother that she would rather walk alone. "That's sweet of you," Rebecca said, gathering her purse and hospital badge. "I don't know what we would do without you." After Rebecca left for work, the kitchen fell into an uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch on forever. David moved around the space with deliberate casualness, cleaning dishes and wiping counters, but Lucy could feel his attention focused on her like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. "You seem very quiet this morning, Princess," David observed, his tone conversational, but his eyes sharp with something that might have been suspicion. "Everything all right?" "I'm fine," Lucy said, standing up from the table and reaching for her backpack. "I should get ready for school." "Of course," David said, but he made no move to step aside, forcing Lucy to brush past him on her way to the hallway. As she did, his hand came to rest on her shoulder, his fingers pressing just hard enough to make her stop and look up at him. "Lucy," he said, his voice soft but carrying an unmistakable edge of warning. "I hope you remember our conversation last night, about keeping certain things between us. Your mother has enough stress in her life without worrying about unnecessary drama." The word unnecessary hung in the air between them like a challenge. Lucy met David's gaze directly, drawing on reserves of courage she had not known she possessed. "I remember," she said simply, and something in her tone must have satisfied him because he released her shoulder and stepped back. The walk to Cedar Falls Elementary felt both endless and far too short. David maintained his usual pattern of casual conversation, asking about her homework and her friends and her plans for the day, but Lucy could hear the underlying tension in his voice, could sense that he was watching her for any sign that she might be planning to break their agreement about the basement. Lucy answered his questions with careful politeness, giving him no reason to suspect that her backpack contained the evidence that would destroy him. But with every step that brought them closer to school, she felt her determination growing stronger, her resolve crystallizing into something unbreakable. When Cedar Falls Elementary came into view, its familiar red brick walls and tall windows offering the promise of safety and justice, Lucy felt a surge of hope that threatened to bring tears to her eyes. Soon, very soon, she would be free of the terrible burden she had been carrying. Soon, Miss Walsh would know the truth, and the nightmare would finally be over. "Have a good day, Princess," David said as they reached the school entrance, leaning down to give her the same goodbye hug he had given her every morning for 2 years. But this time, Lucy had to fight the urge to pull away, had to force herself to endure his touch one last time. "I will," Lucy said, and she meant it more than he could possibly know. As David walked away, his figure disappearing into the stream of parents and guardians heading back to their cars and their jobs, Lucy felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She was safe now, surrounded by teachers and administrators and other children, protected by the institutional authority of the school system that had trained Miss Walsh to recognize and respond to exactly this kind of situation. The morning. Routine of Cedar Falls Elementary unfolded around Lucy like a familiar dance. Children chattering about their weekends, teachers greeting students in the hallways, the comforting bell that signaled the start of another day of learning and growth. But Lucy moved through it all with a sense of purpose that set her apart from her classmates, her mind focused entirely on the moment when she would finally be able to share her terrible secret. In Mr. Thompson's classroom, Lucy tried to focus on the morning lessons, but her attention kept drifting to the clock on the wall and the slow progression of minutes that separated her from lunchtime. She participated in the spelling quiz and the mathematics review with automatic precision, but her thoughts were consumed by rehearsing what she would say to Miss Walsh, how she would explain what she had discovered without breaking down completely. When Emma leaned over during independent reading time to ask if she wanted to sit together at lunch, Lucy shook her head apologetically. "I need to talk to Miss Walsh," she whispered, and something in her tone must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation because Emma nodded without asking any questions. "Is everything okay?" Emma whispered back, her freckled face creased with concern for her best friend. "It will be," Lucy said, and for the first time in days she truly believed it. The lunch bell rang at exactly 12 o'clock, and Lucy was the first student out of her seat, gathering her backpack and heading for the door with single-minded determination. The hallways of Cedar Falls Elementary were filled with the usual chaos of lunchtime, children heading to the cafeteria, teachers ducking into the faculty lounge for brief respites, and the general buzz of activity that marked the middle of the school day. Miss Walsh's office was located on the first floor, just as she had said, in a quiet corner near the library that offered privacy and discretion for difficult conversations. Lucy knocked on the door with a hand that trembled slightly despite her determination, and the sound seemed to echo in the hallway like a gunshot. "Come in," came Miss Walsh's warm voice from inside the office. Lucy pushed open the door and stepped into the small, welcoming space that had become her sanctuary over the past few days. Miss Walsh was sitting behind her desk, eating a sandwich and grading what appeared to be counseling assessments, but she immediately set aside her work when she saw Lucy's face. "Lucy," Miss Walsh said, rising from her chair with an expression of immediate concern. "What's wrong, sweetheart? You look terrified." The kindness in the counselor's voice, the genuine care and attention that Lucy had come to depend on, finally broke through the wall of composure she had been maintaining all morning. Tears sprang to her eyes, and her hands shook as she reached for her backpack. "I found something," Lucy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "In David's basement. I found pictures." Miss Walsh's expression grew very serious, and she moved quickly to close the office door and activate the privacy sign that would ensure they would not be interrupted. She guided Lucy to one of the comfortable chairs arranged around the low table and knelt down beside her, her presence calm and reassuring despite the gravity of the situation. "Take your time," Miss Walsh said gently. "Tell me what happened." With shaking hands, Lucy opened her backpack and pulled out the photographs she had taken from David's basement. She spread them out on the low table between herself and Miss Walsh, watching as the counselor's face went pale with horror and understanding. "He's been taking pictures of me," Lucy said, her voice growing stronger as she finally gave voice to the truth she had been carrying. "And Emma, and other kids from school. Pictures of us sleeping and changing clothes and I think there might be other children too. I heard crying in the basement." Miss Walsh studied the photographs with the trained eye of a professional who had unfortunately seen similar evidence before. Her face was grave but composed, and Lucy could see her mentally cataloging what she was seeing, preparing to take the appropriate action. "Lucy," Miss Walsh said quietly, "you are incredibly brave for bringing these to me. This is exactly what you should have done. These photographs show that David has been committing very serious crimes, and we need to make sure that you and other children are safe from him immediately. The validation Lucy felt at hearing Miss Walsh confirm what she had instinctively known was overwhelming. She was not crazy, was not imagining things, was not overreacting to normal stepfather behavior. David was exactly the monster she had feared him to be. And now there was proof. "What happens now?" Lucy asked. "Now I'm going to call the police," Miss Walsh said, already reaching for the phone on her desk. "They have special detectives who handle cases like this. People who are trained to help children who have been hurt or threatened. And I'm going to call someone from Child Protective Services to make sure you're safe while the investigation is happening." "What about my mom?" Lucy asked, her voice small and frightened. "She loves David. She won't believe me." "She'll believe the evidence," Miss Walsh said firmly. "And she'll want to protect you more than anything else in the world. Parents sometimes have a hard time seeing what's right in front of them, but when they do see it, they act quickly to keep their children safe." Miss Walsh picked up the phone and dialed 911, her voice calm and professional as she explained the situation to the dispatcher. Lucy listened as the counselor described the photographs, the potential for other victims, and the need for immediate police response. Within minutes, she was told that Detective Maria Santos would be dispatched to the school, along with representatives from Child Protective Services. "They're on their way," Miss Walsh said, hanging up the phone and returning her attention to Lucy. "Detective Santos specializes in cases involving crimes against children. She's very good at her job, and she'll know exactly what to do with this evidence." "Am I in trouble?" Lucy asked, suddenly worried that she might have done something wrong by going into the basement, by taking the photographs, by waiting so long to tell someone. "You are not in trouble," Miss Walsh said emphatically. "You are a hero. You found evidence of serious crimes, and you brought it to a trusted adult who could help. That took tremendous courage, and you should be proud of yourself." The word hero seemed too big for Lucy to comprehend, but she felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with relief. The terrible secret was no longer hers to carry alone. Adults who knew how to handle these situations were taking control, and she could finally stop pretending that everything was normal. 20 minutes later, Detective Maria Santos arrived at Cedar Falls Elementary, accompanied by a woman from Child Protective Services who introduced herself as Miss Rodriguez. Detective Santos was a middle-aged Hispanic woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately made Lucy feel safe and protected. "Hello, Lucy," Detective Santos said, settling into one of the chairs around Miss Walsh's table. "I understand you've been very brave today. Can you tell me about these photographs?" Lucy found herself able to speak more clearly and confidently than she had expected, walking Detective Santos through the events of the previous Friday night, describing the sounds she had heard from the basement and the circumstances that had led to her discovery of the photographs. The detective listened without judgment, asking gentle questions that helped Lucy provide more detail without making her feel pressured or overwhelmed. "Lucy," Detective Santos said when Lucy had finished her account, "these photographs are evidence of very serious crimes. David has been violating your privacy and the privacy of other children, and that's against the law. We're going to arrest him today, and we're going to make sure he can't hurt you or anyone else." "What about the other children?" Lucy asked. "The ones who were crying in the basement?" Detective Santos exchanged a look with Miss Walsh that Lucy did not quite understand. "We're going to investigate every lead, including the sounds you heard. If there are other victims, we'll find them and make sure they get the help they need." Miss Rodriguez leaned forward, her expression warm and reassuring. "Lucy, we need to make sure you're safe while all of this is happening. We're going to call your mother at work and explain the situation. For tonight, you'll probably stay with a relative or family friend while we sort everything out." The thought of not going home to the house on Maple Street, of not having to face David across the dinner table or endure his bedtime visits, filled Lucy with a relief so profound that she nearly started crying again She would not have to pretend anymore, would not have to maintain the facade of the happy blended family while her stepfather's crimes went undetected. "Can I call my grandmother?" Lucy asked. Rebecca's mother lived in Columbus, about an hour away, and had always been a source of comfort and safety in Lucy's life. "Of course," Miss Walsh said. "We'll make sure you're with people who love you and will keep you safe." As the afternoon unfolded, Lucy watched from the safety of Miss Walsh's office as her world transformed around her. Phone calls were made, arrangements were put in place, and the machinery of justice began to turn with the inexorable momentum that would soon bring David's reign of terror to an end. Rebecca arrived at the school within an hour of being called, her face pale with shock and her hands shaking as she gathered Lucy into a fierce embrace. The conversation between Rebecca and the authorities was difficult and emotional, but Lucy could see the exact moment when her mother's denial crumbled, and she fully understood what had been happening in their home. "I'm so sorry," Rebecca whispered against Lucy's hair, holding her daughter as if she would never let go. "I'm so sorry I didn't see it. I should have protected you." "It's not your fault, Mom," Lucy said, and she meant it. David had been cunning and careful, presenting one face to the world while hiding his true nature in the darkness of the basement. He fooled everyone. By evening, David had been arrested at his workplace. The basement had been searched and thoroughly documented by crime scene technicians, and Lucy was safe in her grandmother's apartment in Columbus, surrounded by family, members who loved her and would never let anything bad happen to her again. As she lay in her grandmother's guest room that night, with Whiskers purring contentedly on the bed beside her, Lucy felt a sense of peace that she had not experienced in months. The nightmare was over. The truth had been told, and she had learned that her voice, even the small, frightened voice of a 7-year-old girl, was powerful enough to stop a monster and protect other children from harm. She was no longer just Lucy Morrison, the little girl who felt uncomfortable around her stepfather. She was Lucy Morrison, the brave girl who had found the courage to speak up when it mattered most. And that, she realized, made all the difference in the world. 3 months had passed since the night that changed everything, and Lucy Morrison stood at the window of her new bedroom in the small apartment she now shared with her mother on the east side of Cedar Falls. The view was different. From their old house on Maple Street, instead of the familiar maple tree and well-maintained lawns, she could see the parking lot of a modest apartment complex and the distant spire of the Methodist church where her grandmother had taken her for Sunday services during those first terrifying weeks after David's arrest. The apartment was smaller than the house they had left behind, with thin walls and creaky floors that sang a different song than the old Victorian on Maple Street. But it felt safe in a way that their previous home never had, even in the early days when Lucy had still believed David was the kind stepfather he pretended to be. Here, there were no basements filled with dark secrets, no forbidden spaces where monsters could hide their crimes. Here, every door was open, every corner was illuminated, and Lucy could breathe freely for the first time in months. Whiskers was curled up on the windowsill beside her, his gray and white fur gleaming in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the thin curtains Rebecca had hung to make the place feel more like home. The cat had adapted to their new living situation with remarkable resilience, seeming to understand on some instinctive level that they were finally safe from the predator who had stalked them in their own home. "Lucy, sweetheart," Rebecca called from the kitchen, where she was preparing an early dinner before her evening shift at Cedar Falls General Hospital. "Detective Santos will be here in about 20 minutes. Are you ready to talk to her?" Lucy turned away from the window, smoothing down the skirt of the blue dress she had chosen specifically for this meeting. Detective Santos had become a familiar and comforting presence in her life over the past 3 months, a steady adult who took Lucy's words seriously and treated her with the respect due to someone who had helped solve a serious crime. Today's visit was special. Detective Santos was coming to tell them that David's trial was finally beginning, and that Lucy might be called to testify about what she had experienced. "I'm ready," Lucy said, and she meant it. The scared little girl who had trembled at the thought of speaking up about her stepfather's inappropriate behavior had been replaced by someone stronger, someone who understood that her voice had power, and that using it was not just her right, but her responsibility. Rebecca appeared in the doorway of Lucy's bedroom, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her scrubs crisp and clean for another long shift at the hospital. The dark circles under her eyes had faded somewhat in the month since David's arrest, though Lucy knew her mother still struggled with guilt over not recognizing the signs of what had been happening under their own roof. "You know you don't have to testify if you don't want to," Rebecca said, settling on the edge of Lucy's bed and speaking with the careful gentleness she had adopted since learning the truth about David. "Detective Santos says they have enough evidence to convict him without your testimony. The photographs, the basement setup, the other victims who have come forward. It's more than enough." Lucy sat down beside her mother, taking comfort in Rebecca's familiar warmth and the smell of her lavender shampoo. Over the past 3 months, their relationship had deepened and strengthened in ways that Lucy had not expected. The crisis had forced them to communicate more honestly than ever before, to confront difficult truths and work together to heal from the trauma that David had inflicted on their family. "I want to testify," Lucy said firmly. "Miss Walsh says that sometimes victims need to tell their stories out loud to help them heal. And maybe it will help other kids who are scared to speak up." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, as they often did when Lucy displayed the remarkable courage and wisdom that seemed to have emerged from her ordeal. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, pulling Lucy into a gentle hug. "You're the bravest person I know." The sound of a car door slamming in the parking lot announced Detective Santos's arrival, and Lucy felt the familiar flutter of nervous excitement that accompanied these meetings. Over the past 3 months, Detective Santos had become more than just the police officer handling David's case. She had become a mentor and advocate who helped Lucy understand that what had happened to her was not her fault, and that speaking up about it had been the right thing to do. Rebecca went to answer the door, and Lucy could hear the murmur of adult conversation as Detective Santos was welcomed into their small apartment. The detective had been here many times before, for formal interviews and informal check-ins, and Lucy had grown comfortable with her presence in a way that surprised her considering her initial fear of talking to police officers. "Hello, Lucy," Detective Santos said, entering the living room with the warm smile that had put Lucy at ease from their very first meeting. She was carrying a folder of documents and a small gift bag that immediately caught Lucy's attention. "Hi, Detective Santos," Lucy replied, settling into her favorite spot on the second-hand couch that Rebecca had bought to replace the furniture they had left behind in the house on Maple Street. Everything from their old life had been tainted by David's presence, and starting fresh with new belongings had been part of their healing process. "I brought you something," Detective Santos said, handing Lucy the gift bag with a slight smile. "A little thank you for all your help with this case." Inside the bag, Lucy found a book about a young girl who helped solve a mystery by being observant and brave. The inscription on the inside cover read, "To Lucy, thank you for showing us that heroes come in all sizes. Your courage has made Cedar Falls a safer place for children. Detective M. Santos." "Thank you," Lucy said, clutching the book to her chest. "I love it." "I thought you might," Detective Santos said, settling into the chair across from the couch and opening her folder. "Now, I have some important updates about David's case that I wanted to share with both of you." Rebecca took a seat beside Lucy on the couch, her hand finding her daughter's and squeezing gently. These meetings with Detective Santos had become easier over time, but they still brought back memories of those first terrible days when the full scope of David's crimes was being revealed. "First, the good news," Detective Santos began. "David has agreed to plead guilty to all charges. That means there won't be a long trial, and Lucy won't have to testify unless she wants to. He'll be sentenced next month, and based on the charges and the evidence, he's looking at 25 years to life in prison." Lucy felt a wave of relief wash over her. While she had been prepared to testify if necessary, the thought of facing David in a courtroom had been daunting, knowing that he had admitted his guilt, validated everything she had experienced, and eliminated any lingering doubt about whether she had done the right thing by speaking up. "What about the other children?" Lucy asked. Throughout the investigation, Detective Santos had mentioned that other victims had been identified, children who had been photographed during visits to the house on Maple Street, or who had experienced inappropriate attention from David in other contexts. "We've identified 7 other victims," Detective Santos said carefully. "All children who had contact with David through your family or through his work. The photographs you found led us to all of them, and their families have been notified. Some of them are receiving counseling, just like you." The knowledge that other children had been hurt the way she had been hurt was difficult for Lucy to process, but it also reinforced her understanding of how important it had been to speak up. If she had remained silent, David would have continued to victimize children, and the circle of harm would have grown ever wider. "Are they okay?" Lucy asked. "They're getting the help they need," Detective Santos assured her. "And because of your courage in coming forward, David will never be able to hurt another child again." Rebecca squeezed Lucy's hand again, and Lucy could see the pride and pain warring in her mother's expression. The knowledge that her daughter had suffered while living under the same roof was something Rebecca continued to struggle with, despite the reassurances from counselors and other professionals that she could not have known what was happening. "There's something else I wanted to tell you," Detective Santos continued. "The FBI has been investigating David's activities, and they've discovered that he was part of a larger network of people who trade in these kinds of images. Your photographs helped them identify and arrest several other predators across the country." The scope of David's crimes continued to expand in ways that Lucy found difficult to comprehend. The man who had made her uncomfortable at the dinner table, who had violated her privacy and safety in her own home, was apparently connected to a web of evil that stretched far beyond Cedar Falls, Ohio. "So lots of children are safe now because Lucy was brave enough to tell the truth?" Rebecca asked. "That's exactly right," Detective Santos confirmed. "Lucy's decision to speak up didn't just save her. It saved children she'll never meet, in places she's never been. That's the power of one person's courage to tell the truth." Lucy felt a strange mixture of sadness and pride at this revelation. She was glad that other children would be safe, but the knowledge that so many people like David existed in the world was overwhelming for her 8-year-old mind to process. "I have one more thing to share," Detective Santos said, reaching into her folder and pulling out a letter. This came from the FBI agent who worked on the broader investigation. "She wanted to thank you personally for your help." Lucy took the letter with trembling hands and read the official FBI letterhead and the formal but warm words of gratitude from Agent Rebecca Palmer, who wrote that Lucy's evidence had been instrumental in dismantling a network that had been operating for years. The letter concluded with an invitation for Lucy to visit the FBI field office in Columbus if she was ever interested in learning more about how law enforcement agencies work to protect children. "Wow," Lucy breathed, looking up at Detective Santos with wide eyes. "Real FBI agents know about what I did? Real FBI agents, real prosecutors, real judges. Lots of people in law enforcement know about your courage, Lucy. You've made a difference in ways you can't even imagine." After Detective Santos left, Lucy and Rebecca sat together on their small couch, processing the weight of what they had learned. The apartment felt quiet and peaceful in the way that had become familiar over the past 3 months, a sharp contrast to the underlying tension that had permeated their old house even before Lucy understood why she felt so uncomfortable there. "How are you feeling about all of this?" Rebecca asked, her arm wrapped around Lucy's shoulders in a gesture of protection and comfort. "Good, I think," Lucy said, considering the question carefully. "Sad that other kids got hurt, but happy that David can't hurt anyone anymore. And proud, maybe, that I was brave enough to tell the truth even when it was scary." "You should be proud," Rebecca said fiercely. "You saved yourself and you saved other children, and you did it by trusting your instincts and speaking up to adults who could help, That's exactly what brave people do. Over the past 3 months, Lucy had been seeing Dr. Helen Martinez, a child psychologist who specialized in helping young victims of abuse and exploitation. Dr. Martinez had helped Lucy understand that the uncomfortable feelings she had experienced around David were her instincts trying to protect her, and that trusting those feelings had been exactly the right thing to do. The therapy sessions had been difficult at first, requiring Lucy to revisit painful memories and confront the reality of what David had done to her and other children. But Dr. Martinez had also helped her understand that healing was possible, that the trauma she had experienced did not define her, and that she had the strength to move forward into a bright and hopeful future. Dr. Martinez says that some people who go through bad things become really good at helping other people who go through similar experiences, Lucy said thoughtfully. Maybe someday I could be a police officer like Detective Santos, or a counselor like Miss Walsh. The idea of Lucy channeling her experiences into a career helping others made Rebecca's heart swell with love and admiration for her daughter. At 8 years old, Lucy was already showing the kind of empathy and courage that marked natural leaders and advocates. You could be anything you want to be, Rebecca said, and whatever you choose, you'll be amazing at it. That evening, after Rebecca left for her shift at the hospital, Lucy sat at the small desk in her bedroom, working on a school project about community heroes. She had chosen to write about Miss Walsh, the school counselor who had taken her seriously, when she needed help, and who had known exactly what to do with the terrible secret Lucy had been carrying. Miss Walsh had visited Lucy several times since David's arrest, both in her professional capacity and as someone who had come to care deeply about Lucy's well-being. The counselor had helped Lucy understand that speaking up about uncomfortable or inappropriate behavior was always the right choice, even when it felt scary or difficult. As Lucy worked on her project, describing Miss Walsh's kindness and professionalism and the way she had made Lucy feel heard and believed, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that terrifying night in the basement. The scared little girl who had been afraid to articulate her discomfort had grown into someone who understood the power of her own voice and the importance of using it to protect herself and others. The apartment was quiet, except for the soft sounds of whiskers purring on her bed and the distant hum of traffic from the street below. It was a different kind of quiet than the oppressive silence that had filled the house on Maple Street during those long evenings when Rebecca was at work and Lucy was alone with David. This was a peaceful quiet, a safe quiet, a quiet that belonged to people who had nothing to hide and nothing to fear. Lucy finished her essay about Miss Walsh and set it aside, then picked up the book that Detective Santos had given her. The story was about a girl not much older than Lucy who helped solve a mystery by paying attention to details that adults missed and by having the courage to speak up when she witnessed something wrong. As she read, Lucy found herself thinking about the other children Detective Santos had mentioned, the 7 other victims who had been identified through the investigation of David's crimes. She wondered if they were healing the way she was. Healing. If they had counselors and detectives and family members helping them understand that what had happened to them was not their fault. She thought about the children across the country who had been helped by the broader FBI investigation, kids she would never meet, but who were safer now because she had found the courage to take those photographs from David's basement and show them to Miss Walsh. The ripple effects of that single act of bravery continued to spread in ways that Lucy was only beginning to understand. The sound of a key in the lock announced Rebecca's return from her abbreviated shift at the hospital. The demands of caring for Lucy through the immediate aftermath of David's arrest had required Rebecca to reduce her hours at work, and they were still adjusting to the financial realities of their new life. But Lucy had learned that safety and peace of mind were worth more than material comfort, and their small apartment felt more like home than the house on Maple Street ever had. "How was your evening, sweetheart?" Rebecca asked, settling on the edge of Lucy's bed and smoothing down her daughter's dark hair. "Good," Lucy said, closing her book and turning to face her mother. "I finished my school project about Miss Walsh, and I started reading the book Detective Santos gave me. It's really good." "I'm glad," Rebecca said. And speaking of school, Miss Walsh called this afternoon while you were at your appointment with Dr. Martinez. She wanted to tell you that there's a new student in second grade who seems to be having some problems at home, and she wondered if you might be willing to talk to her. The request surprised Lucy, but it also filled her with a sense of purpose that felt both exciting and important. Miss Walsh believed that Lucy's experience and courage qualified her to help another child who might be facing similar challenges. "What kind of problems?" Lucy asked. "She wouldn't give me details over the phone," Rebecca said carefully, "but she thinks this little girl might benefit from talking to someone who understands what it's like to feel scared and confused about adult behavior." Lucy considered this for a moment, thinking about the scared little girl she had been just a few months ago and how desperately she had needed someone to tell her that her feelings were valid and that speaking up was the right thing to do. "I think I'd like to help," Lucy said finally, "if Miss Walsh thinks it would be good for her." "We can talk to Miss Walsh about it more tomorrow," Rebecca said. "But I think it's wonderful that you want to help other children. It shows how much you've grown and healed." As Rebecca tucked her into bed that night, Lucy felt a sense of completeness that had been missing from her life for longer than she cared to remember. The nightmare of living with David was over, the legal proceedings were moving forward, and she was surrounded by adults who loved and protected her. But more than that, she had learned something fundamental about herself and her place in the Idai world. She had discovered that even a small voice could make a big difference, that speaking truth to power was not just possible but necessary, and that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite that fear. "Mom," Lucy said, as Rebecca was about to turn off the bedside lamp. "Yes, sweetheart? I'm glad we moved to this apartment. I'm glad we're not in that house anymore." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, as they often did when Lucy expressed sentiments that revealed how much she understood about what they had been through together. "I'm glad too," Rebecca said softly. "This feels like home in a way. That house never did. And Mom, I'm glad I told Miss Walsh about the photographs, even though it was scary." "I'm glad you did too," Rebecca said, leaning down to kiss Lucy's forehead. "You saved yourself, and you saved other children, and you showed everyone how brave and strong you are." As Lucy drifted off to sleep that night, she thought about the little girl who would be starting at Cedar Falls Elementary soon, the child who Miss Walsh thought might benefit from talking to someone who had faced similar challenges. Lucy hoped she would be able to help, to be for this new student what Miss Walsh had been for her, a trusted adult who would listen without judgment and help her find her own voice. Outside her bedroom window, the lights of Cedar Falls twinkled in the darkness, and Lucy felt a deep sense of connection to her community and her place in it. She was no longer just Lucy Morrison, the little girl who had been victimized by her stepfather. She was Lucy Morrison, the brave girl who had spoken up when it mattered most, who had helped bring a predator to justice, and who was now ready to use her experience to help other children find their own courage. The healing would continue, Dr. Martinez had told her. There would be difficult days and setbacks, moments when the memories of what David had done would feel overwhelming. But there would also be joy and growth and the satisfaction that came from knowing she had made the world a safer place for children. As sleep finally claimed her, Lucy's last conscious thought was of tomorrow's visit to Cedar Falls Elementary, where she would sit in Miss Walsh's comfortable office and help another frightened child understand that her voice mattered, that adults were there to protect her, and that speaking up was always the right thing to do. In her dreams that night, Lucy saw herself as an adult, perhaps a police officer like Detective Santos, or a counselor like Miss Walsh, or maybe even an FBI agent like the woman who had written to thank her for her courage. Whatever career she chose, she would spend her life protecting children and helping them find their voices when faced with adults who sought to harm them. The little girl who had once been too frightened to articulate her discomfort had grown into someone who understood that her experiences, however painful, had given her the tools to help others. And in that understanding, Lucy found not just healing, but purpose, hope, and the unshakable knowledge that she would never again be silent in the face of injustice. The morning would bring new challenges and new opportunities to use her voice for good. And Lucy Morrison, brave survivor and fierce protector of other children, was ready for whatever came next.